Hi, everyone. Welcome to this evening's event. My name is Bree. I'm the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith, located in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If it's your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you join our community today, and we appreciate your support of the authors and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at any point at our discretion, attendees can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. So now on to the fun part. Our moderator this evening is New York Times bestselling author of hundreds of comics and nearly 24 novels, Greg Rucka, and he has written for film, television, and video games. He is currently developing his image series Lazarus, co-created with Michael Lark. His career has included critically acclaimed and Eisner-winning work in both creator-owned and work-for-hire arenas. Greg, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
It is very nice to virtually be at the store.
And the author of the hour tonight, Antony Johnston, who is also a familiar name on the New York Times bestseller list as an award-winning graphic novelist, author, and games writer. He has written more than 30 graphic novels, comic series, and books, and his graphic spy thriller, The Coldest City, was made into the multi-million-dollar blockbuster Atomic Blonde, starring personal favorites Charlize Theron and James McAvoy. Tonight, Antony and Greg will be discussing Antony's new novel, The Exphoria Code. This techno thriller follows Bridget Sharp, a hunted MI6 agent hacker who uncovers a conspiracy and terrorist plot that soon has her.
Silly man.
That soon has
amateur move.
You always have to have at least one cover floating around, right?
That's your job. He's got two. Fine.
Well, I'll be dropping a link in the chat for anyone who wants to learn more, and
wants to buy the book from you,
which would be wonderful. And we would appreciate.
That is the goal.
All right, so I'll leave you guys to it.
Yeah, so actually, I think it's important to note that Exphoria came out actually a while ago in the UK. This is for the US release, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And there is actually a second bridge book, which I see behind you,
Yes.
that hopefully will be following on the heels of the first to the US market.
I certainly hope so, yes.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, you know as well as anyone, let's be frank, that depends on how well the first book sells. But yes, the second book is out here in the UK, certainly. And Pegasus, the publishers of the US edition of Exphoria Code, have an option on the second book.
Very good. So has Exphoria is now out in the US?
Yes, it came out as we speak about 6 or 7 days ago.
All right, so there's absolutely no excuse for people not to order it from the kind people at Brookline, who I'm sure will be able to ship it to you wherever you are, because they were kind enough to host us. So I was rereading the novel this past weekend, and I was trying to compile. I'm not often on this side of the moderation, right? I'm normally the target, not the sniper. And I am trying, I wanted to offer a little bit of difference because in particular, having come off all the press for the old guard, I was actually asked the dreaded question, where do you get your ideas? Which I had always thought was a cliche, and I don't want to go there with you. But
I want to talk about rookie mistakes.
Well, but what I wanted to say, because I was looking at this and looking over your work, and in particular, I'm thinking of like in graphic novels in the Fuse, looking at your substantial body in software and video games, which is, for people who may not be aware of this, I mean, you are a lion in that particular den. You have quite a resume of video game writing at this point. You seem to, and going back even to early comics work, I'm thinking about The Wasteland as well now. You have a consistent intersection, I think, between technology and its impact on humanity and on society. And I am very curious as to what in particular draws you to that, because knowing you, and in the interest of full disclosure to everybody, we've known each other now for a really long time.
Yeah.
So, I read Exphoria and I can see things in Bridge that I'm like, oh, well, that's literally Anthony going, I like this, I'm putting this into this character. But that particular affinity for technology has always been something that's fascinated me about you as an author, and I'd like to hear you talk about it.
It's a tricky one really to explain, because it is one of those things that has always been with me. You and I, as you say, we've known one another for a long time, and we're of a similar age.
Mm-hmm.
We're old enough to remember a time before personal computers.
Well, we're certainly old enough to remember Usenet. So
right, yeah. Well, but also literally old enough to remember, before Space Invaders.
Yeah.
Which, that's literally a dying breed.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe it's that love of the new, maybe it's that neophilia, because when video games became a thing and when home computers became a thing, they absolutely fascinated me. And partly I think this is born of a love of just a sheer love of sci-fi that I've had ever since Star Wars. I was 5 years old when the first Star Wars came out. I saw it when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I've loved it ever since. And I'm to this day remain a huge sci-fi fan, and maybe that's got something to do with my love of technology and the possibilities in technology, but also being cognizant of the risks in technology, as we have seen over the last few years with the way that social media can be abused, for example. The way that computers, which were supposed to liberate us and set us free and make us a people of leisure who would work 4 hours a week and the robots would do everything else. Instead, we seem to be working more than ever, and we're doing it at these damn computers. It's been fascinating.
Well, and not to throw too many spoilers out, but the inherent threat, or at least part of the threat in Exphoria, is an extension of that technology out of control, or technology perverted. And it starts from a place specifically with a type of technology that, for all of its positive uses, has been, directly and grossly militarized.
Yes.
No,
that's absolutely true. And drone technology is one of those areas that was so quickly adopted by the military, that it's a bit in the same way that, say, the big dog stuff that coming out of MIT, those labs, that's so clearly being designed for military capability, even though there are civilian possibilities for it and civilian uses for it. It is so obviously being targeted, the development of it, at the military, as opposed to other technologies which are much more freeform and malleable.
There is an argument to be made, and I have for years felt that, and I can't remember where I heard it. I must have heard it very young, but human beings, the first thing they do when presented with a new technology is go, can I use it for sexual gratification? And if I can't, can I use it to murder somebody? Yeah. And only after answering those two questions do they go, is there any way I can use this to, say, improve society? And I would argue also that, talking about social media, you look at a drone, the hostile applications of a drone are immediately apparent. The hostile applications of social media were immediately apparent to a lot of people, but to the rest of us, we were either willfully ignorant or, or blissfully naive.
Yeah. Well, but that goes back to what you were asking to start with, which is what My fundamental belief is that no matter what the technological advancements we have in society, people will always be people, for good and for ill. Technology is an enabler, and it can bring out the best or the worst in us, but that best or worst is already in us. I mean, that's what you mentioned, the fuse. That's entirely what the fuse was about, that even in space, even in a space station, in a floating tin can 22,000 miles above the Earth, there will still be crime and people will still kill each other. You know, that will still happen if you get enough people and enough of a society together. Wasteland, in a way, was about the same sort of thing, even though that was a much more fantastical vision of the future.
And we should clarify. We should just really clarify that The Fuse is a graphic novel series that you did and is published by Image Comics. And again, if people are interested, they can find these trades. And The Wasteland was by Oni Press, yes. and is a titanic work. It is truly an epic and worth hunting down as well. Sorry, go on. Oh, I just figured I would plug for you, you see.
You see, that's very kind. Yeah, I mean, the Fuse was murder mysteries in space, and Wasteland was what if the world ended and nobody could remember how or why. But then also with, you know, psychic powers thrown into the mix and stuff because, hey, comics.
Oh, don't disparage our birth medium, sir.
But Exphoria is it's an outgrowth of that same philosophy. At least it felt like it to me when I was writing it, in that, again, the base motives and the urges and the motivations of the villain, for want of a better descriptor, are entirely base. They are entirely normal and nothing that we haven't seen for, you know, the last several thousand years. But the technology enables that plot to unfold in a more modern fashion.
That's you sort of anticipated my next question, which was, when we talk about constructing antagonists, you know, in our fictions, you know, whatever the medium, there is oftentimes this need to, quote unquote, make them understandable, but also to make them complicated. And I find, I can remember very early on in my writing career being told that it wasn't enough that I had a good person murdered, that I needed to throw in a bombing or something else. And I remember being very indignant at the thought that the murder of an innocent should be more than enough to propel a story.
Yes.
Do you find yourself running into that? Because most villainy is so banal. I mean, do you find yourself going, I have to sexy this up somehow?
Well, I think there's two sort of sides to that. The first is that I've always struggled with villains and antagonists. Always. That's always been a big stumbling block for me, and is without doubt the thing I struggle with the most when I'm conceiving an idea, because so many fictional villainous plots are unnecessary. And that's because, as you say, true villainy and true evil is actually very, very banal. And most people just want to get rich and, you know, live free of rules and restrictions. And they're not actually interested in ruling the world with their robot army, or, you know, but you know what I mean.
I do.
And I've always struggled with that. And that's one of the reasons why in Exphoria and also in Tempest Project, the villains, as I said, again, the villains' motivations are quite sympathetic and understandable. And that speaks to, you know, yes, making the villain somebody that a real person can relate to. You can understand why they are doing this, you know.
Up to a
beyond,
point.
Yeah, exactly. Beyond their sort of desire to, steal all the gold from Fort Knox or whatever.
No, I find it.
I really like Goldfinger, by the way. I'm not knocking it. It's a great film.
Oh no, knock it. It has not aged well. I mean, the antagonist problem is an enormous one. You know, when you are looking at trying to find the reasons outside of the normal reasons, that one person will do a horrible harm to another. There are really only 2 or 3 answers to that question.
Right. Yeah,
It,
and they do come down to very base
yeah,
answers.
I mean, it tends to be in my experience, which is not to say I've done it, love, greed, or ideology. And one could argue that ideology fits into love. So I find it interesting, in particular, that in Exphoria, and it's in the title, which was kind of you teasing, I think. You know, the Exphoria Code implies that you'll open this up and need to need to Da Vinci code it. But you very adeptly manage what is, I think, for most of an audience, let me put it this way. There's nothing more boring than watching hacking on screen.
Oh, yes, I know.
All right. Watching hackers in a movie is the most tedious thing in the world, because there's only typing can only become so exciting.
Well, this is why in things like NCIS, you get the ridiculous situation where you have 2 people typing on the same keyboard. That actually happened in a scene in NCIS. It's notorious, just to try and make it look interesting, because otherwise, you say it's fundamentally somebody sitting at a keyboard.
Yes, it is. It is the most boring thing in the world to watch a writer do is write.
Yeah.
Yet in Exphoria, and I have not read Tempest yet, but I'm assuming it's going to be the same. You managed to take not only arcane programming knowledge, you know, or I should say rarefied programming knowledge. It's knowledge that most of your readers don't have. And you give it a narrative propulsion that is really very impressive. And I want to know how you did it so I can steal it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the compliment, not for the theft.
Well, I haven't done it yet.
It is, so you know the old adage that every fight in a movie or a comic book, whatever, is a conversation, is a story within itself. That's what I try, the same principle that I try to bring to the scenes of hacking and computer chicanery and what have you, is to clarify the motivations and the why of the scene. The how is there. It's there for people like me who enjoy reading that sort of stuff, for people who want to follow along. But I try very hard to make sure that the how is, it's only important that you understand the why and how the how is achieved, if that makes sense. You know, the skills that the character is bringing to bear to achieve something. The actual technical details, while they are there, and like I say, you're right, I go to pains to make them as accurate as I can, they're not 100% necessary to follow the story. And that's very deliberate, because I know that, as you say, most readers are not going to have that knowledge, and frankly don't necessarily want that knowledge. But what they do want is to understand why the character is doing this thing, what it means to them, the stakes, why it's important. And so I try to make sure that that is the driving force in those scenes, rather than the literal technical aspects. I mean, there are a lot of those scenes in Exphoria, and even more in Tempest, actually. It's for others to decide whether I succeed or not. But that's how I try to approach it, to make sure that, and I do explain everything for the less technical reader. I try to, sort of put things into layman's terms so that you can follow along. But I have had letters from readers who've said, like, I kind of, glossed over a lot of the technical stuff, but it was okay. I still followed everything. And in a way, that's a real compliment.
Mm-hmm. Do you, I mean, this goes to a question of research. I am not aware of you as a diehard hacker, but I could be wrong. I mean, I do know that your Usenet bones, for instance, are legit.
Yes.
You know, but the actual deafness, and not solely with regards to programming and so on, but we're talking about the intricacies of SIS and box and so on. You know, what was that research like? How do you go about doing that? And I ask that again because I myself am a research junkie.
Oh,
So.
I know you research far more than I do even. And I do a fair amount, but I know that you do lots more. I'm not a hacker. My programming knowledge is actually very limited. I can code a website. Like my website is hand coded. I'm quite proud of that, even though there's no reason to be proud of that in the year 2020. But there you go. I built it first in 1996, and I've maintained it ever since. But as you say, my Usenet bones are legit. I've been online since the early 90s, and that I've been around a lot of programmers and, frankly, hackers. And I still know some people who are far more knowledgeable about that side of things than me. And what I will tend to do with these books is devise something that I want to happen and then go to those people and say, okay, how do I make this happen? And of course, quite often what I get, and there's a very good example of this in Tempest actually, is an answer that actually scraps my original idea with something that's much better. And that's, you know, those are the moments that you live for. In terms of research into SIS and box, I mean, that's the same research that you've done, really.
Yeah.
My depiction of SIS in Exphoria is, well, certainly the cyber side of it is completely fictional. That's not based on any real unit or, you know, reality that I've come across in my research of SIS. And that was done purely, that was kind of built around the character of Bridge and how I needed her to be. Now, I've been told by some people who are in a position to know that, you know, not that I struck a nerve exactly, but that I may have come closer than I perhaps realized
Well,
in the writing of it.
It's the logical extrapolation game.
Yeah.
If
exactly.
A, then B, then logically we get to C, and then people standing at C go, how did you get here? And it's like, well, I used my brains.
Yeah, exactly. And
But,
I know that's something that you place a lot of
oh yeah,
weight on.
yeah, it is. You know, we had early conversations about this years and years ago when you wrote the Queen and Country story as well, which is, you know, it doesn't have to be real. It needs to be plausible.
It's
right?
exactly. That is one of the most important pieces of advice that anybody ever gave to me. And I still rely on that now, even as I'm writing the Brigitte books 20 years later. I still think back to that. Seriously.
I got one. We've got questions coming in, and we'll go to these in a bit. And I see one of them is from David Goldwitz. Hello, David. Where did Brigitte come from? I give you the French. Where does Brigitte come from? She seems
when she's in London, she's Brigitte. When she's in France, she's Brigitte.
she seems to me, and I think you and I are similar in this regard. She seems like somebody who had been around for a while, waiting for her day.
If that's true,
I mean,
it
may not be a fully formed thing. Like I find, for instance, that I will some of my characters will be like, "Oh, you were there for a while." Like Andy is a good example. Andy was around for a good 20 years.
But
before,
were you aware of it?
No, it wasn't until maybe 2013 that she even got a name, and the
Right.
first name she got wasn't the right one. And it wasn't until I started writing it that I was like, "Oh, that's who she is." But she'd been living rent free for a while, and I wonder if that was going on with Brigitte.
Well, I mean, names obviously are really important, and Brigitte was called several other things before Brigitte. I was a good quarter of the way into the book before I finally settled on her final name. She had been called Gabrielle, and Sophie, and her surname was different, and all manner of stuff. I wound up giving these names to other characters in the book instead. Yeah, if she was there, I wasn't aware of it. But when I came to write Exphoria, and part of this, is rooted in the reason why I was able to write it, which of course was the success of Atomic Blonde, giving me enough time to go, okay, I can actually afford to just take 6 months off and write a novel now, which I just simply hadn't been able to do previously. I wanted to make sure that I was writing a character that I would like to be around for several books to come, that I could bear writing. And I don't mean to necessarily make her literally likable, but that I would understand, and that whose motivations I could sympathize with enough that I could bear writing her for years to come.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's why she kind of, as you say, you can see parts of me in Bridge. Although I will say there's a lot of Bridge that has nothing to do with me at all, and is instead drawn from other people I know, or just purely from my imagination.
Yeah.
But there are absolutely aspects of her which align with me. There's no doubting that. I won't say she sprung fully formed, but I don't know. It just, as I was writing her, it was a character where I thought, well, I'm just going to write this with no restrictions on the character. I mean, no commercially minded writer, I think, would write a character who was obsessed with 1980s and 90s goth music. That's not,
I'm actually not sure about that. And I do think that the commercial eye is a separate one. I think that it's what I find interesting is that writers get asked, is this character based on somebody, or is this character based on somebody? And the answer is, yeah.
Yes and no.
They're based on everyone.
Yeah.
And me. I am taking things and I am using them. But she is so beautifully drawn and so clearly drawn, and I felt compelled to ask. I've got 3 more questions, and then we can do the Q&As. I am, and this is something that you and I both clearly enjoy espionage.
It has been remarked upon.
Yes, I am curious how you were grappling with, and in particular with Tempest now. There's that fine line, right, between, as we mentioned Goldfinger before, the Bondian espionage, which doesn't really care what's happening in the real world. It just ignores it and uses it as a backdrop and creates the specters and the smirches and madmen with laser cannons and so on. And then there's those of us over here who are like, hey, Le Carré was onto something. How can we make that work for us in a fashion that is not, for lack of a better phrase, entirely literary minded, shall we say? Because we're looking to entertain fully.
Yeah,
but
it is tricky though. Yeah,
but
I mean, you say Le Carré had, was onto something, but I think. And again, this kind of goes back to this idea of people being people. One of Le Carré's greatest strengths is that his characters all feel like they are motivated by real wants, needs, and desires. Look at Taylor of Panama. That it's not even really about spying. And I just think that's what you have in times like these. That's what an espionage writer has to cling to, because I have struggled with this. Tempest, I kind of got lucky in that the path that took me down was was specific enough, but also general enough that I could drill into it without worrying whether it would age badly. I was actually more worried about that with Exphoria because of the sheer rate of advancement in drone technology. Luckily, the real world hasn't quite caught up the book yet, but it is getting very, very close.
This is precisely the question, right? Because we are bound when we are writing this kind of fiction to the moment we're in. And Exphoria is a very different novel post-Brexit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, and I am currently struggling with, I have just finished outlining the third Brigitte book, but I can't even contemplate beginning to write the draft until next year.
Yeah.
Because I need to know what is,
Yeah.
I mean, quite apart from the pandemic, we are staring down the barrel of Brexit, and I need to know what that situation is going to be like.
Absolutely. This is one of the reasons why I haven't reapproached Queen and Country, because I do not know what QNC looks like in a Trump and Johnson world. I got no clue.
It's I mean, yeah, it is. It's a tricky situation to gauge. You have to expect that obviously government employees will have, should we say, an easier time traveling around Europe, but not if they're undercover, which is obviously a big part of espionage fiction.
It is. You sort of nailed two of my questions there, but I do think that that sort of, how much do you worry about how it's going to age as you're putting it together, as you are building the story?
That is tricky. That is always the trickiest part of any kind of technology themed fiction, isn't it? I don't know. I kind of trust that I'm looking far enough ahead, because obviously, these novels, they're not science fiction, but I am allowing the technology to take a step forward beyond where we are for the sake of the story, for the sake of plot, and for the sake of the concept. So I just kind of have to trust and take it on faith a little that, the real world at least will give me a period of some years grace before they seem hopelessly outdated. And as I say, I have been lucky so far. Real world drones aren't quite yet up to the same level as they are in Exphoria. But like I say, we are getting there all the time. And Tempest is about hacking groups, Russian hacking groups operating in satellite states of Eastern Europe, former communist states. And I mean, that is a thing that is alleged to be happening right now, but has not been proven. And there are other aspects of technology in the book that you never know who's watching. There are other aspects of technology in the book that are also, things that people are working on, but that are not yet out in the public sphere. And so, as I say, I hope that I have a few years grace.
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the technology byword. It used to be that anything that was in the public domain, the military / government had access to a good 10 years prior. And that window is now shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, so that...
because the military is using the same computer technology that we all have access to.
Exactly.
They have bigger computers, but they can't do anything more than we can. Well,
and the problem is that once it's out in the wild, the problem, it is the problem with trying to write, for instance, any collective mystery. If 60,000 people are watching or reading it, somebody's going to get it right. Oh, yeah. If you have, 50,000 people with access to the same suite of tools, they're going to figure out applications that, the people who designed those suites never, ever imagined.
This is something, actually, just to take a quick tangent, this is something that I've been trying to get across to video game developers for the last 10 years, and sometimes succeeded and sometimes not. There's still a belief that you can have some kind of a puzzle or mystery in a game, and that it will take players, a few weeks to figure out. And I'm like, have you never heard of Reddit?
Yes.
Do you not watch playthroughs on YouTube? These things will be solved within hours of the game's release. And it's tough sometimes for people to understand that.
Yeah, well, but I think it also places the focus on the wrong thing, right? Which is, in my opinion, it places the focus on the destination as opposed to, for lack of a better phrase, the journey.
And that's exactly what I've been trying to get across.
Yeah. If you take me there in a fair and just and entertaining manner, I don't care if I figured it out, right? Stories are arguably, and it's funny when we talk about art, very structured things. A proper story will do certain things and end certain ways. And once you are hip to that language,
Oh yeah, you can spot the clues. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it becomes about something else. So
I wrote a completely new spec murder mystery over the summer to avoid writing the next Brigitte book. And, and a friend, one of my beta readers who read it, got back to me a couple of weeks ago, and he said, like, "Oh yeah, I figured it out like halfway through who did it." But he said, "But I didn't care because I was enjoying it so. It was such an entertaining read. I didn't care that I knew who'd done it. That wasn't important."
Do you? It sounds to me like you're moving more to prose. Is that where you want to be?
It's where I am. I mean, you.
Well, that's not an answer. It is where you are. Is it where you want to be?
It's where I like being right now.
Hmm.
But you know as well as anyone that my career has kind of ping-ponged all over the place between media and genres alike. So I kind of go. I've been really lucky and fortunate that I've been able to just kind of follow my whims throughout my career. And this is where I find myself now. I enjoy it a lot. It's a very nice place for me to be at the moment. But I am still writing video games. I am still, sort of ticking over the third Coldest City book in my head. These things haven't gone away. I just seem to be spending more time writing prose at the moment. But as I say, it's not like the other stuff has gone away necessarily.
At the risk of brushing up against NDAs, can you tell us what things you're working on now?
Not in video games.
No, obviously not. You're NDA'd, but
I've just finished 2 years on a big video game that will be released next year. But I literally cannot talk about it until it's released as part of the condition of the NDA. And I'm in talks to start on another big video game that would see me going for another year or so. I'm, like I said, working on the third Brigitte book. I am hoping that this murder mystery that I wrote over the summer might turn into a series. I have The Organized Writer, obviously just came out a couple of weeks ago as well. Although I don't think there'll be a sequel to that, but
the even more organized writer.
Look, what else? Oh, well, and you know what this is like, the usual Hollywood stuff. I have umpteen meetings a week with producers and animation houses and what have you about doing things that may or may not come to fruition sometime in the next 2,000 years. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, the perpetual vaporware of Hollywood.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think I'm going to hit some of these questions for you. I'm going to read them. This is from Mr. Ben Bashir. It says, you both obviously write strong female protagonists. Do you find you start with the character or the concept of your world first? How do you find these women open up your stories in ways male protagonists don't? I'm directing that at you because they're here for you.
All right, but I'm interested to hear your answer as well. I mean, to the first part, to me, they're inseparable. And I think you'd probably answer the same as well. The character and the world kind of grow together. If I had to say which is more important, I think it's the character, of course. But the character lives in that world, and the character is the character she is because of the world in which she lives and the job she does and the tasks she undertakes. So they're really symbiotic. I don't think you can have one without the other. As to the second part, I have admittedly ideological reasons for writing female characters, female protagonists. But beyond that, I find that they allow me a sense, or not a sense, they allow me a degree of emotional honesty in the prose, which I find difficult to achieve with male protagonists, and maybe
Really?
that says more about me.
I'm
than
curious. Yeah, I'm curious as to
else.
why that is.
I genuinely don't know, but I just find I find it much more easy to write emotionally and to access the consequences of those emotions. And you know in Exphoria there is a literary streak running through the book of Bridget's family life and her relationships with her family and her own mental health issues. And I personally find those much, actually, maybe saying easy to write about, that's not fair. I find I can write about them better. I find it more effective to write when I do so from a female perspective.
Huh. I find that's a very interesting answer. And I think somebody, when they're writing their doctorate thesis on your work and goes back to this, will find that intriguing. I think, for myself, simply because you asked, I find that certainly in modern / contemporary settings, writing a female protagonist, there are immediate dramatic dividends because we live in a sexist world.
Yeah.
And the benefit of that is, every single trope it looks different when you recast the gender on it. And if you're honest to your protagonist and remembering that gender is part of character, not character, then you reap dividends there. I think
it ups the conflict, doesn't it? All plot is conflict, or all story is conflict, and as you say, for a woman living in the modern world, all conflict is twice as significant.
Well, it is augmented. I find that I find actually that for me, I get the characters tend to suggest themselves. I don't really construct them. They just sort of show up. So sometimes they'll show up and they'll be bringing their world with them. And sometimes they show up and I have to figure out where that world is. But it is an odd relationship, and I don't quite get it, to tell the truth.
I tend to think of my character creation process is, and you could do this from the outside in or the inside out, but I do try to bring a skeleton, at least. I will have some idea of this is the kind of character I want.
Mm-hmm.
But the flesh on the bones and the details and their personality and their voice, that absolutely just comes out in the writing. That will reveal itself to me as I write them.
I think that's you just mentioned the organized writer, and I think that's indicative as to the kind of writer you are. That you are very structured in that sense.
Yeah.
And I applaud you for it, because I am a roiling mass of chaos, I think. Ben has a follow-up. He wants to know who you see Charlize playing in Exphoria.
That is a very good question. I mean, the most logical role for her in Exphoria, I suppose, would be Andrea, except that Andrea is supposed to be a 5 foot tall.
She ain't 5 foot tall.
Yeah. You and I have both stood next to her. She is not.
Yeah, no, she goes
a bit taller than that.
She goes all the way up.
She really does.
And Ben, the second part of that is if Charlize was in Lazarus, probably Savara Bittner. So David Goldblitz asks, does the gross like I said hi. He wants to know, does the gross ineptitude and casual disregard for the health and safety of humanity of the Trump administration cause difficulty in creating bad guys? Fictional villains are always smart and competent, but reality is showing us that idiotic indifference can be just as, if not more, destructive.
Tell us what you really think, Dave.
It is actually an interesting question right now in this moment, because what Hannah Arendt referred to as the banality of evil, we are now literally soaking in it.
Oh yeah.
it changes the nature of how one approaches fiction, I think.
It does, although there is always that, and you kind of alluded to this earlier when you were talked about sort of the structure that people expect from a story. There is always that old canard of people expect stories to make more sense than real life. They expect characters to be more consistent than real people. And if those things are not true, they will accuse you of not writing realistically and not writing realistic characters.
Yeah. The running joke right now is that the writers of 2020 totally have lost the plot.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you wouldn't believe this if you were watching it on TV. You'd have turned it off by now.
The paradox of fiction, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think writers can take solace in that to an extent, in that readers will actually always want things to make sense more so than real life. On the other hand, this, I've mentioned it already a couple of times, this third Brigitte book that I'm planning at the moment does, and how could it not, writing something in this day and age, does play on that a little bit. There is more of an element of that incompetence of evil running through that book than the first two, because I wrote the first book before Trump was elected.
Yeah.
And then as soon as he was elected, my agent said, "So do you think you could get some references to Trump in there?" And I was like, no,
Firstly, that'll break the world.
Well, firstly, I don't want to. Secondly, I really don't want to date the book.
Yeah.
Which that absolutely would. What I did was that there is one allusion in the book to the White House leaking like a sieve these days. That's my sole, that I added in afterwards, but that was my sole concession.
Fair enough. It genuinely has changed the game, I think, in some ways, and in ways that I'm not certain can be ignored. I think a lot of other fiction is going to be able to survive the pandemic without having to write about pandemic. And honestly, I think that we're going to see a lot of entertainment media that is not going to want to see a lot of people with masks, because that's not why we're going to it. But this burn is going to linger, shall we say so? Jeff,
actually, just following up on that, one thing where I have again struggled recently, and actually this was an issue with Tempest as well, has nothing to do with the Trump administration, or not specifically anyway, and that's post Snowden, post Prism. The idea in, it has been long been a trope in spy fiction that what you are trying to do is to stop the other side from getting your secrets, because they're so scandalous that if they're exposed, there would be terrible repercussions. You can't write that now.
No,
because we've seen what happens, and what happens is people go,
yeah,
and that is a real, I think that's more of a problem for modern espionage writers. And I think it's why, and you did this so well in your Alpha novels, it's why so much of what we think of as espionage fiction these days is actually anti-terrorist fiction, because that's such a more, and again, I don't want to use the word easier, but it's a more understandable, more immediate threat.
It's easier to grab.
Yeah.
It's easier to grab and define and explain. Yeah, absolutely. Jeff Quest has two. He says, what do you appreciate about writing in the espionage genre that you don't get in other genres? And the follow-up to that is, given that we've both written espionage in comics and novels, which do we find easier in comics versus novels? I guess the question is, do we find it easier in comics or in novels?
Hello, Jeff. Jeff has asked me both of these questions before in other venues.
and you keep dodging them? Did he catch you this time?
No, they're good. They're good questions. They're good questions. I've said this before, but I love mysteries. At the core of everything I write is mystery, and that's whether it's sci-fi or fantasy, or there is always some kind of mystery to be solved or uncovered at the center of my plots and my stories. And what I love about espionage is the ways in which that mystery can be hidden, can be revealed, can be obfuscated, can be conceived, are myriad compared to most other genres. And I think that's one of the reasons why I do gravitate towards espionage and have done for, some years, both in reading and writing. As for comics versus novels, I mean, I don't know about you. I suspect this is the same for you. I don't approach a story without knowing what medium I'm going to be writing it in. And so the medium informs how I tell the story and informs the story itself. So,
well, wait.
It's
So
really
it goes
hard to say.
idea. So it goes idea, and then medium.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. So it's hard to say what's easier in comics versus novels, because I wouldn't tell the same story in both media.
Mm-hmm.
There would be, I mean, you could give me the same concept and I'd work it up for both media, but I would work it up in different ways to take advantage of each medium.
Yeah. I mean, that is the benefit with facility in the different forms, right? You can, this is going to be better served as a novel. This is going to be better served as a comic. This is going to be better served as a teleplay or as an interactive story, or et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Mr. Jim Dugan. Hello, Jim.
Hey, Jim. Hello.
It says, when writing prose versus comics, are there differences in the mechanics of your storytelling, plot, character development, apart from it not being a collaborative medium? Or maybe just because comics are more episodic? He's just curious, he says.
That is, I mean, that's a question for the ages, isn't it? I mean, not all comics are episodic, of course, because we have graphic novels exist, and I have written many of them. But yeah, the main difference between the two when conceiving a story and plotting a story is simply the sheer amount of stuff that you need in a novel as opposed to a comic, even a densely packed comic. And you and I have both written fairly dense comics, amongst our work, but there's nowhere near as much sheer story and number of scenes in those comics as there is in a novel. And the other thing, of course, is the moment-to-moment storytelling that you need in a novel that you can kind of get away with not addressing so much in comics. So
I think of it as a difference in magnification.
Yeah.
Comics do not, in the main, allow themselves for broad stories to be zoomed. Novels, the danger of a novel is that you can zoom in on everything.
Yeah.
You can literally spend a page and a half describing what somebody is wearing.
Yeah.
Even if it serves no purpose to do so.
But you can also spend that page and a half inside a character's head, which on the comics page is death.
Yeah, you can't do that.
You can't do that. And that's one of the things that I really like about prose that you can't do in comics, is being able to do that. But that, again, informs the story. Because I know I can do that, I have a tendency to write stories and characters where that will be interesting, where spending time in their heads is going to be a source of entertainment.
Very cool. Ms. You have a fan, yet another, the divine Ms. Ludwig. I appreciate a story about work, non-work life intersecting in ways that aren't always predictable. How did you navigate the goth versus the MI6? So this is somebody who's clearly read the novel.
Yeah, with difficulty. It's true. It's true, with difficulty. I mean, on the one hand, I try not to keep referencing the goth thing with her character, because it is just a part of her and it doesn't influence how she does her job necessarily. But on the other hand, it is a part of her and has been for many, many years. So it also can't be avoided. I mean, that is one area, I guess, where I drew on my own life and, being a goth myself, working in an office many, many years ago when I was at Future Publishing. It's the sort of thing, it does come up occasionally. Especially when you're arguing over the Office CD player.
I I had a question for you about your early days and writing for IF and so on as well, but we skated past it. Keep going. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it is a balancing act, and it is a tricky one. But I felt it's so integral to the character that you can't not address it. And again, it does play into her mental state, and some of the sort of mental health issues that she has. Not that being a goth causes those issues, but it is absolutely true that some of those issues can be found to be more prevalent in people involved in that scene. There's kind of correlation is not causation, but there is absolutely an overlap.
You sure?
There is absolutely an overlap. And again, that's part of it. And then the other thing is that I don't want to shy away from it, and that's why there are scenes, I mean, not so much in Exphoria, but in Tempest there's a scene where Bridge literally goes clubbing, and again, there is motivation behind it. It's not gratuitous, it's part of her character development, but we watch her get dressed to go clubbing and go out, gothed up to the nines to step onto a dance floor.
Do you view yourself as a ex-goth at this point, or? Well,
I mean, it depends whether you count, sort of whether you have to be practicing, as it were.
yeah. Are you a practicing goth, Antony?
Yeah. Elapsed. Oh. It's a long time since I stepped onto the dance floor of a goth club, but I did it for so many years, so many times, and with such fervor that I feel confident I can, recreate those moments in my fiction.
Yeah. You will still bleed black should you cut yourself, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my record collection is, look at,
I can't.
Still very.
You wear it honestly. So, Mr. Ben Russell says, based on Antony's comments about realistic and sympathetic villains and a love of mysteries, one might think that traditional amateur detective fiction would be a natural fit. Is the Summer Draft mystery novel the first foray into that genre? Why so late in coming?
Yes, and I don't know, because I had lots and lots of other things to write first, I guess. A lot of my career, and you know this just because this is something that you and I I've told you before, a lot of my career is based around whether I feel confident enough that I am able to take on a story. And it took me many, many years to come to terms with the idea that a certain amount of fear and trepidation is actually completely necessary.
Yeah.
And that
you don't write the stuff you know. Yeah, you don't write the stuff you know you can do. You exactly. Write the stuff you're not sure you can do. So
yeah. And it took me some years. That's the sort of thing that, I'm saying this now, and if there are any writers out there, you won't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me. It's the sort of thing you have to learn for yourself, but it is absolutely true. And yes, that's sort of the murder mystery fiction, if you like. I mean, I've written murder mysteries. Obviously, The Fuse was murder mystery stuff, but those were cops. The kind of traditional amateur detective fiction, I don't know. I just didn't feel that maybe I would have been good enough to have a handle on it before now. And again, these are my own issues. This is just my own sort of mental state.
I think it's frankly, I mean, murder mysteries are very difficult. A good mystery is very difficult to do. And I think that you have distinguished yourself in accomplishing it, not only multiple times, but in multiple media. So, yeah.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
So more will be welcome, I think. We have brought this in at about an hour. So I think I want to say, if you have not picked up the Exphoria Code, you should do so. You should meet Brigitte, and you should see what Antony does that I think is so remarkable in this novel. It is a genre that could easily become techno porn, or military porn, for lack of a better phrase, where we spend a lot of times talking about, or a lot of time on the page talking about the TC-1735/S and its capacities and how it must not fall into the Russians' hands or whatnot. But the trick of novels like this is that they don't mean anything if there's not a human connection. And I think the Exphoria Code is an absolutely splendid example of that kind of connection being maintained under this nice crunchy shell of techno espionage. So there you go. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you, and Bree, thank you for letting me ramble.
Of course. Thank you guys. I did unmute myself. Okay, good. Thank you guys so much. And thank you to our audience. Those are some really, really good questions.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming along. It was that was a lot of fun.
From one lapsed goth to another. Have a good night.
Yeah, I was going to say, now we're going to send Anthony to bed now that it's 1 a.m. in Lancashire, right?
Yep.
All right, well, sleep tight.
Cup of hot chocolate.